Hi everyone and welcome to these tutorials in on functions in Python. So in this tutorial we are going to look at what functions are in Python and why you need to learn them, whether you're a programmer or a data analysis, or why they are really important in programming in general. Okay, so before going into that, let's look at why functions are important. Okay, so functions allow us to write reusable code. So without functions, the logic we will write for maybe when building a specific software, or when performing analysis on Python, or when performing data analysis, will be so enormous. So with functions, we can be able to write one logic and then use them every point of our software. Okay, so that's essentially what Python allows us to do. In fact, because of Python, you can actually now use other functions that other people have written inside your own code without having to know the underlying ways that that functions actually work. So Python's functions, or functions in general, actually allows you to like write code that you can reuse or also use other people's code, especially those functions that Python has actually given to us natively. Okay, function also makes your programs to be modular and readable. So essentially, because Python eliminates repetition of code, your code is now simpler and people can actually be able to read and understand your code. And also because of that, because people can now read and understand your code, it will be easier for you to have collaborators. So for example, if you are building a bigger software, you will need people to join you in knowing in building that particular project. And for you to do that, they have to understand how your project actually works, or how your code runs and everything. And because of functions, that makes your code readable and reusable, and people will be able to simply just understand what your project is, and which improve collaboration. And because of that, you can scale your logic efficiently. You can improve your functions, add new logic to your function. In fact, you can improve your functions to any way you can think of. All right, so that is like the importance of why you should learn functions. Now, um if you're watching this video as maybe someone who is trying to learn data analysis, functions are also very important, because you're also going to write code, you're also going to use other functions that Python has made available for you. Having a clear knowledge of this will make your work very easy. So what are we going to cover in this tutorial? Few things. We are going to look at how to define functions, how to define and call functions in Python. We're also going to look at what are parameters, return types, and default arguments, and what are arguments in Python. So we're also going to cover some best practices when it comes to Python, and of course we are going to show you real examples of how to define functions in Python. So let's go straight into our system and see how to actually define, create, use function in your system. And this is going to be a very short tutorial. Okay, so let's head over to my Jupyter notebook here. So in my Jupyter notebook here, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this file Python function. Okay, now if this is your first time of seeing Jupyter notebook is widely used in the data science, data analysis ecosystem. It works just like other Python environment, where you can write your code and see outputs directly. Okay, I use this especially when I'm recording tutorials, because it is more simpler to set up and everything. Right, so let us see how to define a function. Okay, so the first thing you do is to start with the def keyword. Now this is a reserved keyword that Python allows or gives us to decorate whenever we are defining a function. Okay, so you start when you're defining a function, you start with the def keyword. All right, so once you've done that, you follow with the function name. So let's call this greeting. So what this function is going to do is that whenever you call it at any time, it's going to greet someone. So then we use these two open and close brackets. Okay, and then once we've done that, we follow it by this column. So first use the def keyword, which actually tells Python that whatever is going to follow next after it is going to be a function. And then you open and close these two brackets, and then the def keyword. Okay, now with that, you've actually defined a function. Now every other thing after that line will be what you want that your function to do for you. Okay, so in this particular instance, we want this function to print a good morning. Okay, so anytime somebody call this function, is going to greet the good morning. So good morning. Yep. So good morning, and we are going to close the print statement, and just like that we finish defining our very simple function. Okay, now if we save this now, we can call that our function everywhere. And before we call our function, I need you to know that whenever we are creating a function, at this point when we are creating this particular function, we call this particular point function definition. Okay, so when you are creating a function, we call this function definition. So in case someone asks you, where did you define a particular function, you can simply tell the person, go to this particular project folder, you will see where I defined that function, because the person is simply asking, where can I find the function, where is this function located. All right, so when you've defined a function and you need to use that function, that particular point where you're using that function, we call that particular point function invocation or function calling. Okay, so when you want to use a function, you simply call the function or you simply invoke the function. So at this particular point, what we need to do now is to invoke our function. So if I invoke our function by greeting, so the way you invoke our function is to write the name of the function followed by the open and close bracket. So once we run this right now, you can see that the function will simply return good morning to us. Okay, so now you can see that at this particular point that there is an error in this particular place. So assuming we did not have a function, when we discover this error, we will start looking for every place where we've printed out this kind of statement, and we'll correct that error. Okay, but because this particular error is simply coming from this function, I can simply just go to this particular place and clean this. Okay, and I run this, and then if I come here, I'll run this, and that particular error will be removed. So even if I've used or I've called this function in a lot of place in my system, once this particular error is corrected in this function definition state, it will reflect on every part of that function or any part that that function is called or invoked. All right, so assuming you're building a software that will require you to write good morning in several places, you can see that you can just simply define the function in this single place, and wherever you call this built-in function, it will simply return good morning for you. But that is not just all we have about function. Okay, function also have a very important part that signify the conclusion of a function. So let's create a simple function that takes two number and return the sum of that number. So we are going to call this function perform sum, and you can see how descriptive my function names are. It is a best practice for you to give descriptive name for your function, so that when somebody sees it, somebody will simply quickly understand what that function is all about or what that function is doing without scratching his or her head. Okay, so it's always very advisable that you use a descriptive function name. All right, so this function will take two variables, and the way you specify that the function is going to take a variable is to specify it as an argument when you're defining that function. So in this particular place, I can say that x here and y here. So what this I'm saying is that when somebody is calling this function, the person must pass two variables to that particular function. Now, what type of variables that the person pass depends on the use case of that particular variable. But we can also specify that the variable that the person should pass should be a string by doing something called typecast. So in this particular place, we can do int and string. Yeah, so by doing this, we are simply saying that the first variable that the person is going to pass should be an int, while the second variable that the person is going to pass should be a string. It's always advisable. I think some persons will say there is no need for that, but for me, I really prefer that we specify or we cast the type of function or the type of variable rather that somebody should pass into that particular function. This will really help us to eliminate errors. But in this particular instance, I'm just going to keep it very simple. So this function is going to accept two variables. Of course, if you want this function to accept three variables, you can actually specify another one here and say it should going to accept three variables. Now the name of these variables here doesn't really matter. The function simply knows that you are saying that it should pass x, y, and C variables, whatever. It should be just 3 variables. Okay, so you can name this whatever you want. All right. So once again, at this point, we need to, put this particular place. And now a function have something called a return statement. Now this is optional depending on what you're doing. But if you want your function to return something back to you after it has performed an operation, you should use something called a return statement. So return statement here actually return a value back to you after that function has done its work. All right. So in this particular case, we want this function to return the value of x plus y. Okay. Now, whatever this value returns here is independent of whatever the function does. Okay. So this function can do, for example, this function must have done something like x times or x multiply by y. Okay, maybe when you call this function, it does x multiply by y, but what you want is simply x plus y. So this function, the return statement now is independent of whatever the function is actually doing. It only looks at, it only bothers or is only concerned with what you require that it returns back to anybody who is going to call this function. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now this return statement also signify the end of this particular function. What I mean is that what I mean now is that you cannot come here again. Okay, let's make this very well. What I mean is that you cannot come here and say something like results equals x plus y. Okay, you cannot do this. This would not be recognized by this function, or it will be something called out of scope, which we are going to talk about later. So at this particular point, this function is not aware of this particular variable anymore. In fact, this will throw an error. So what that tells us is that a function ends at that particular return statement. All right, so let's remove this right now and we save this. Okay, they say there is a syntax error right here. So let's see what the syntax error, invalid syntax. So let's fix this particular guy, and I'm going to fix it this way. I'll turn this here and I'll turn this. Okay, so let's run this again and see. Invalid syntax. Okay, so I'm supposed to add an equals to here. So that is it. I'm supposed to add an equals to in this particular place. So if I run this right now and I call this function, let's invoke this particular function once again. So if I come here and I call this function again right here and I run, you can see that this function will return something. Okay, the same perform meeting 2 positional variables. Very good. So when we call this particular function here, this function throws an error because it requires for us to pass through parameters into this particular function. Okay, so let's just pass through parameters. I can pass 2 and 4. Okay, and I'll save this right now, and you can see that we have 6 because 2 plus 4 will return 6 for us. The sum of 2 plus 4 is actually 6. All right, so without this return statement right here, this function will not be able to return any variable back to us. But because we added a return statement right here, once this function finished processing whatever it is doing inside, it will return a statement back for us. So let's think about this. Let's say, for example, you set an alarm for an anniversary. Okay, so maybe you set today is like 24th and you set an alarm for like 30th. Okay, so every day once your phone is on, what that particular function for the alarm is going to do is that it's going to keep checking if that specific anniversary date has arrived, but you're not going to be aware of that. It's not going to alert you that it is actually checking your calendar. So it's going to check that at the background of your PC or the background of your phone. So until it gets that specific date and time where you set for the anniversary reminder, it is going to return back a message for you and with maybe a ringing tone and tell you that this is an anniversary. So that's exactly how a function works. A function can perform different complicated tasks, but the value it will return to you, or the thing it will return to you, is dependent on what you specify in this particular place. So again, we can simply come here and say specify or return a string called concluded. Okay, concluded. Okay, so we can do this, and when we run this now, it is going to say okay, we have an error here. So Let's add that. So let's save this now. And if we come here now and run, it's going to return concluded for us. So it is independent of whatever the function is doing right here. It is simply going to return what you specify. Okay, so that is simply how you define a simple function and how you call a function. It is as simple as that. So let's actually put this into practice and create like a simple calculator and see how we can create a calculator that actually computes different numbers depending on the operator. Okay, so let's create a function again. We are going to call this function calculator. So this function is going to be calculator. So whenever somebody calls this function, the person is going to pass two variables x and y, and then the person is going to pass something we are going to call operator. Okay, so we are going to call the next variable operator. Okay, let's use a short form of that. And so what we want to do now is that let's combine our function with an if statement, and we've covered if and else statement in our conditional tutorial. If you've not seen that, you should go back and watch that, or you should look somewhere in our screen and you will see something on conditionals. Okay, so what we are going to do right now is that the operation that this function is going to calculate on the two variables that will pass into it will be dependent on what the operator is. So if it is like an addition operator, it's going to perform an addition. If it is a multiplication, it's going to perform a multiplication. If the operator does not exist, it's going to say unknown operator. Okay, so let's create a variable here. We are going to create this variable. We are call this variable result, and we are going to assign it to 0. So the value of that variable will be 0. Okay, now let's start. If ops, so if ops, which is this variable now, is equals to, if it is equals to plus, if it is equals to plus, so what we are going to do is result is going to be equals to x plus y. Okay, result is going to be equals to x plus y. S if ops, yeah, right here again. So I'm just going to copy this now. I'm going to copy this, is equals to subtraction. Results now is going to be equals to results will be equals to x minus y. Okay, s if again ops equals to multiplication. So I'm going to copy this right now. It is going to be x multiplied by y. Okay, and then finally s, that is if none of these condition meets, we are going to print out something like operator not found. Operator not found. Okay, now yes, as you can see, this our function is a little bit more complicated than the one we've written before, and this is just to show you that a function can be very simple, it can also be very, very complex. All right, now let us save this and see if we get any error. We don't have an error, so let's call our function right now. So the first one I'm going to call calculator. So I'm just going to copy this. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to pass 5 here. I'm going to pass 6 here. And I'm going to pass plus, which is going to be a string in this case. So I'm going to pass this, and what we fail to put here is our return statement. So let's add our return statement so that our function will return something to us. So return results. So it's going to return results for us now. It's going to return results. So let's save this right now and see. So at this point, we save this and we save this. Okay, so the result of 5 plus 6 is 11 because we use a plus sign here. So you can see now that we can use our calculator at every point in our code. So let's say we come to a point where we need to multiply those two numbers. So if we come here now, we can simply just change this without writing a new function. Okay, we can simply just change this right now, and if we save this, it's going to return the multiplication of those two numbers for us. If we come to a point where we need to use subtraction, so we can simply just paste this right now and just change the operator to subtraction, and if we run this right now, it is going to return a subtraction sign because it's going to be x minus y. Okay, it's going to be minus 1. Okay, so you can see from a very simple function to a little more complicated function, we can use function to do a lot of things. You can see that our code now is very clean because we define this function in a simple place, in a one single place, and then we keep using this function at every point. When if we assume that this function was not created, we would have simply create a function that will perform addition, create another function that will perform multiplication, create another function that will perform subtraction. But our code is now very, very simple. Alright. Now the last thing I'm going to show you in function is something called a scope. Okay, something called a scope. Now in function we have something called scope. Now a scope is the position. A scope simply define or try to clarify the position of your variable. So for example, if I have a variable here called age, if I create a variable here, I call this variable age and I will assign this to 27 or 27 rather, yeah. So I'm going to define a function called find age. So the name of this function is going to be find age. So whenever we call this function, it is going to return an age for us. So inside this function, I'm going to create another variable called age here, and then I'm going to assign it to 30, and then I will return age. Okay, I will return age. Now if I save this right now and I call this function, or I invoke this function now called age, what do you think is going to return for me? Okay, so let me come here and correct this. So age. So what do you think is going to be the value of the age here? Is it going to be 30 or is it going to be 27? Okay, let's find out. So if I run this now and I save this, it's going to return 30 for me. That is because despite the fact that we have two variables around here called age, function is only aware of the variable that is inside of it. So we call that a local scope. So we can simply say that this age here is local to this particular function. Okay, so function is not aware of this particular age because this age right here is global scope. Okay, so whenever you have a variable that's of the same name and one is outside of the function, we call that particular variable that's outside of the function, we call that global variable. Why that same variable that is inside the function is called local variable. So functions are always aware of its local scope before it start working with the global one. So for example, if there was nothing like this in this particular place and we save this function right here and then we run this now, it's going to return 27 because there was no variable called age inside of it. So it start working with the variable that is outside of that particular function. Now if you want to specify, if assuming you want to specify that age here should actually be this particular guy, you can simply use something called global. So there's a keyword called global that Python reserve for us. So you can now say global age. So this global age right here now, let's spell this correctly. This global age right here now is now pointing to this particular age. So using that, you can be sure that the age inside that your particular function is going to be referencing this particular guy here. Okay, now by best practice, it's always recommended that whenever you're working with a function, you should work with variables that are inside local scope. The reason is because the local scope can change and you will not be aware. And if maybe you're performing multiplication and this is a constant variable and then it changes without you being aware of it inside your function, it can lead to an unintended result. Okay, so all variables that are used by a function by best practice should always be defined inside this particular function. So we should depend by the age variables that we have inside this particular place. Okay, so like anywhere this variable or anywhere this function is used, if we want to change the value of this age, we can simply come to a point where this function is defined and simply just do that. Okay, so that is the basics of everything you need to know about functions in Python. So we've covered what functions are. We've also covered how to define and call functions, and we've covered parameters, return values, and arguments. And then we've also covered some best practices, especially in terms of global scope and every other stuff. So that is all you need on how to create functions. You can advance this by creating more complicated functions and use it in your program, and it will still be based on this knowledge that you've gathered from this tutorial. Once again, thank you for watching the tutorial. See you in the next one.